One, two, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Sales Hacker Podcast. It's your host, Sam Jacobs. Today on the show, we've got Stephanie Blair. Stephanie was a career executive and individual contributor at eMarketer, which was sold to Axel Springer, I think in 2015 for $242 million. Since then, and since leaving eMarketer, she has launched her own consulting and coaching firm focused on mindful leadership and effective, authentic, empathetic leadership. She calls it Know and Flourish, and we talk about what makes a great leader in the modern era, in the modern business world. How do you develop those skills? We talk about imposter syndrome and why it plagues so many different people, including yours truly, the host of the Sales Hacker Podcast. And we talk about processes that you can use to improve your hiring process and make it more effective for new candidates. So great conversation. Before we get there, we want to thank our sponsor. Our sponsor is Outreach. Outreach triples the productivity of sales teams and empowers them to drive predictable and measurable revenue growth. By prioritizing the right activities and scaling customer engagement with intelligent automation, Outreach makes customer-facing teams more effective and improves visibility into what really drives results. Please enjoy this interview with Stephanie Blair. Hey, everybody, it's Sam Jacobs. Welcome to the Sales Hacker Podcast. We're excited today to have on the show Stephanie Blair. Stephanie is the founder and CEO of a company called Know and Flourish, which is really her executive coaching and consultancy focused on grooming and growing innovative talent within sales-centric and growth-focused teams. She helps leaders and their teams more effectively communicate to drive business results and is an expert in digital transformation and in fueling modern organizations for sustainable success. Prior to Know and Flourish, she spent over 8 years at eMarketer in assorted individual contributor and leadership roles. And before that, the New York Daily News. Stephanie, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sam. It's great to be here.
We're excited to have you. So the first thing we like to start is your baseball card. We like to understand and contextualize your expertise, and that will lead us into a conversation about Know and Flourish. But first, tell us a little bit about your career in sales, growing up in sales, and your most recent experience at eMarketer. What is eMarketer? How did you start there? Tell us a little bit about it.
Sure. So I joined eMarketer from the New York Daily News. I was there at the New York Daily News at a time of digital evolution, but obviously in a print climate that was a tricky climate to grow in. And so I decided I wanted to get to the heart of the digital ecosystem, but didn't want to sell advertising anymore. And through that journey, found eMarketer, thanks to a wonderful recruiting partner, CFW, who opened up my eyes to the world of digital research, which is what eMarketer does. It's a leading researcher for digital transformation, and it works with everybody from small startups to large Fortune 500 brands. Every major publisher agency that you can think of works with them. So I had started by managing a book as an account manager, and I found the job to be pretty reactive. People were sitting back, sort of collecting contracts, 5 logins here, 10 logins there within research departments. But we realized that digital was really all about disintermediated information and that there had to be more individuals at these firms who could benefit. So what we decided to try out was to push an enterprise model there. And it was rather successful. So that led me on my journey of growth at eMarketer as the business was growing from 10 million to later 50 million and later sold to Axel Springer for $242 million. So I was on that journey. And in that time, I was able to lead the London organization as we were focused on international growth. At the time, we had 100 users in 100 countries, but only one office in New York. So after a couple of failed attempts or different models that they had tried, they said, let's bring somebody from headquarters and see if we can prove out the model, which we did in 2 years. I came back, contributed to the growth before Axel Springer. And then in my last 2 years there, led the accounts team and customer success org as a VP of account management.
Wow, that's incredible. Incredible trajectory. Question. So what was it? You mentioned you wanted to prove out the model in EMEA, start up that London office. What were the key lessons that you learned taking some of the skills that you developed in New York, in the US, and trying to replicate them in Europe? What were some of the key learnings and maybe some of the key things that you would avoid in the future?
Sure. Well, I do think it was smart of the business to put somebody from headquarters who had been successful at headquarters over there prior to me leading up the charge there, they had just tried to handle it from remote markets or hire the best in class people in the local market, but there was never that bridge from headquarters to the local market. So I do think that was really important as I became a mouthpiece for what was needed internationally. I do think our challenge was that we didn't seed the market in terms of market awareness and marketing efforts early enough. And so we were trying to do that in tandem with commercially growing and growing out a team. And so that was challenging, especially in a market like Europe, where they had established research relationships already. And as a newbie from the US, they sort of make you sweat it out a bit. So that could have bought us some time. But I do think partnerships really helped, and teaming up with some of the world's leading media firms, like we did events with Facebook, for instance, and some of the ad techs there, and that helped us to gain some credibility.
Awesome. Fantastic. When did you, let's learn a little bit about your background. How did you, we asked this of a lot of guests, a lot of folks on the show, because so many people have non-traditional paths that lead them into sales. How did you find your way into sales? Tell us about, what were your first jobs selling? When did you know you were going to be a good salesperson? Walk us through a little bit of that journey.
Sure. Well, my friends would say that I negotiate everything and that I was born a salesperson, but I didn't really recognize my talent in it, I guess, until high school. At that time, I was really involved. I was always like a type A overachiever, involved in lots of clubs and activities, dance, soccer. And so in some of those leadership roles, I really had to advocate for the group that I was supporting or try to, in the case of my musical experience, we had to raise money by selling ads, and I realized I was the top seller in that capacity. And so I knew it came naturally to me, and I liked that hunt and that competitiveness of achieving a certain goal, but I didn't really know what I would do with it. I decided to study international business and French. My goal was to move to France after studying abroad there. I'm also a French citizen, fun fact.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah, so my mom is French and helped me gain my citizenship, so I have an exit plan, depending on how the selection goes. But,
unfortunately, it's an exit plan to a place with higher unemployment and a more...
Exactly.
We need more dynamism in the labor market for this to be a credible threat.
Anyway, my goal was to move to France, but before I could graduate, I first had to get an internship. That was a requirement at my alma mater, which is Loyola College, now Loyola University in Baltimore. And I didn't want to spend my summer in Baltimore. I wanted to come back up to the tri-state area. I grew up in northern New Jersey. But my folks are not business people. My mom's a teacher. My dad is a small business owner. And so I couldn't really tap their network. I didn't know anything about the job market, but I was able to leverage a family connection who was an advertiser at the New York Daily News. He worked for Ashley Furniture, one of their biggest advertisers. So he got me an internship interview, and I was pumped because this internship paid a small stipend each week. So I was able to gain an opportunity supporting the advertising department within the New York Daily News. I liked advertising. I liked the paper. I liked the idea of commuting into the city. But even then, I negotiated to only work 4 days a week so that I could make some real money on the side before studying abroad in Paris. So that was a fun way of getting in. But after 4 days there, I was bored stiff, and I begged them to do something more than staple papers. And finally, they said, all right, well, we have thousands of restaurants in Queens. Nobody advertises with us, or we don't have enough advertisers there. See what you can do. And they teamed me up with a Queens rep who became my mentor. And he's still a dear friend today. And we were able to create a new product, drive revenue, and get some advertisers on board, which was really fun thing to see in just a short summer.
Wow, that's amazing. And so and then after Loyola, you went direct back to the New York Daily News.
Well, yes, my original plan was to spend the summer home, waitress, find my path to France. And after 5 days of post-graduation, my old boss from that summer internship called me up. He knew that I was home and I had stayed in touch with some friends there. And he said, why don't you just come back here? You're not moving to France tomorrow. Come give us 6 months and see what you think. And I ended up staying 4 years, partly because I met my husband 2 months into that 6-month commitment. So if you ever want to know about the appropriate way to handle an office romance, we can talk.
I might come back to you on that. So, it strikes me as I'm listening to your background that you've been through two pretty massive transformations. One, you went through the financial crisis,
right?
And two, you were selling print advertising at the moment, or, roughly, maybe not the beginning, but probably like the third or fourth quarter on its way to decline, and through that digital transformation, as you mentioned. So you've seen pretty harrowing times. I'm sure a lot of people, it's scary when things are changing in a negative way, in a rapid way. And I think that sort of leads me to want to talk a little bit about Know and Flourish and about mindfulness. But when you think about lessons of leadership, as you've seen great leaders and then leaders that haven't succeeded go through these difficult times, what are some of the things that emerge for you? Because I know you're focused on a new type of leadership. When you were looking at the people that are running these print publications, maybe as you're selling advertising into your transition to eMarketer, and you remember some of the leaders that did it really well and some of those that didn't do it as well, what comes to mind?
Well, I think there needs to be a certain agility, obviously, especially in an environment that is changing so rapidly. And there were those folks who sort of hung on to their old ways of doing things and sort of were in denial. So first and foremost, it's about like a true understanding about what's going on and having their finger on the pulse. But then once they observe that things are changing, being completely open to that change and being tireless in their pursuit of figuring out the new way forward. And so I was lucky enough to have a couple of leaders at the Daily News who really embraced that. When I saw at eMarketer, when I worked and partnered with leaderships going through change, I think the same thing is true. There's one way of doing things that may work for a period, but if the results are stagnating, or if you're not continuing to grow at a certain clip, you need to adjust. I also think it's about the whole person, especially in sales. We're so focused on results and the bottom line and achieving our quotas, but there's a humane way of doing it. And there's a way of doing it where you bring your whole self to the process. And the people who do that, I think, really are the ones who flourish.
So let's dive into that a little bit, because, and to your point, right, Flourish, that's the name of your firm is Know and Flourish. Why is it called Know and Flourish?
Well, when I was looking at the other sort of strategic advisory companies out there, I think a lot of people come in, give a set of recommendations, and leave. And I really wanted my focus to be on sustainable results. And so flourishing to me means sustainability and sort of growth that can live on. So that's my short answer for why the name. But I also think, who doesn't want to flourish? It's one thing to achieve your goal or hit a certain target, but to do it in a way that you really feel like embraced your full set of skills and abilities, makes you feel good. And I want to make people feel good in their ascent to leadership, or as they're, cranking out big goals.
Makes sense. So when there's this phrase, mindful leadership, and you talked about bringing your whole self to work. What does that mean, I guess? And what's an example of, I guess, because I get personally tripped up with that phrase. Sometimes I feel like it means that you can be, bring your feelings, but sometimes my feelings are angry, and sometimes my feelings are impatient. And if I want to bring my whole self to work, maybe that means that I snap at somebody because I had something bad happening at home. So how do you know how much of your whole self is the right whole self? I'm just sort of curious, when you think about what that phrase means and you think about specifics in terms of what's appropriate versus not appropriate, how do you define it?
Sure. Well, I think of mindful leadership as someone who, like a mindful leader is someone who cultivates focus, clarity, creativity, and compassion at the service of others. So they put others first, but, and in some cases that could mean they put the business first, so they have the goals and the focus in mind, but they do it in a way that really flexes each individual's best muscle, right? So you were talking recently with another guest about how to have an executive presence, right? And how to lead others when they don't necessarily report to you. I think that same philosophy can apply to how you manage your team. Not everybody's going to want to be motivated or managed the same way. And so a mindful leader recognizes that, understands the person at one layer beneath the resume, right? Knows what makes them tick, knows about their personal life a bit, and really tries to, turn up or down the dial depending on what that individual needs. And that could change over time. So a mindful leader is also somebody who recognizes that, a top performer could actually be going through a really hard personal time and moves things out of the way within the business to make sure that that person gets what they need in terms of support in that moment. And then the business then gets that back in 10x,
When you're working with a client individually and you're trying to help them develop mindful practices, what are some of what do you do? If I wanted to hire you, and what would we spend our time doing or talking about? What are some of the specific activities that you do to help develop some of these skills?
Yeah, it's a journey, but I think it always starts with an assessment, and there are different assessments for different situations. If I'm assessing a team climate, it's one, but with the individual, I tend to favor something called Standout. It's the same guys who created Strength Finder, and it's a wonderful assessment because it looks at how you handle situations and what your sort of default settings are as it pertains to work-related situations that come up, challenges. And I also do sort of a 360, have the client do a 360 assessment. So between their own anecdotal experience, any past reviews they may have done, the standout assessment, and their 360 questions that are answered by peers and friends and whatnot, direct reports, we then can figure out, the how they do things and the why they do things, not just the what they do. And so that I think is really mind blowing for some people who are like, hey, I've led global sales. I'm able to bring a business from X to Y. I can build a team. That's great. So can thousands of other people. Why should they hire you? And what is unique about your proposition and experience that you can bring to the table? And I help them figure that out. And then it's about building a strategy around that. I think, especially for job seekers, leaders who are looking for a new role, it's so important that they have a set of values that they're going to bring to the table, and that they're quizzing the leaders that they're about to join forces with, or the firm that they're about to come on board for, and make sure that there's some alignment there, because again, that's what's going to create long-term sustainable success, and that's what I'm all about.
So let's redact any personal information. Obviously, we want it completely anonymized. But what are some of the interesting or common things that come out of a self-assessment or a standout assessment, or some, when you see patterns, or when you're just thinking about some of the folks that you've worked with over the past couple of months? What's a common gap or area where they need to focus that maybe they didn't expect?
Well, I think it's different for everybody, but one example comes to mind. I think what it's about is like sort of busting any of their own personal myths. So somebody might come to me and say, hey, I'm only looking for startups that are Series A or Series B, and that's it, And then we do this assessment and we find out that actually their superpower is solving puzzles, is looking at information, seeing trends, and piecing things together. And sometimes that data and that history might not be there in a Series A company. So pivoting their focus to say, hey, you know what, I'd actually be better at like a Series late B or C, where there's already been some growth, and now it's about getting to that next level of growth, because there's a pattern to recognize and to draw conclusions around, and that's where I can make my best recommendations. So it's stuff like that where, other times it's validating. They tell me that they're a mindful leader and that they really lead with the heart and care about their people. And then the assessment shows that to be true. Well, great. The leadership fit then is even more important, as is the scope of work, to make sure that you have the bandwidth to be leading in that way. So it's about helping them match up, their unique value proposition with the firm's opportunity.
I like it. So it sounds like a lot of what you do is is through this job search process, helping people define and assess their own values and qualities, and then making sure they're a good fit for the company that might hire them. Is that right?
That's right. And I would say that's about, a third of the people that I work with are going through a transition. Others are new to a climate or are climbing the ranks within a company. And that's just about refining and developing skills that they may not have had to use before. So for example, if a director is becoming an AVP, or an AVP is becoming a VP, or somebody's showing up as a new VP in this new climate, how are you navigating the politics? How are you, again, showing up as your whole self and making the mark that you want to make in those critical first 100 days or first 2 quarters? I'm really passionate about helping leaders through that journey as well.
How do you make a great impact in the first 100 days? What's your point of view?
Well, first of all, I do think it's about picking your battles. It's also about understanding the sort of the pace of things. Sometimes, I work with a lot of high achievers, so sometimes their intensity overshadows that of the org that they're joining. And so it's like, all right, why don't we start at 80% for the first couple of weeks, get in observation mode, make those connections, collect as much information as possible. Then once you observe the themes, you can then rally around a couple of like 2 or 3 core missions. You have to make those missions known, and then you go out and do it. But you're going to find things that then come across your path that really don't fall in your wheelhouse, but especially in a startup, like somebody's got to do it. So making sure that whatever you pick up align to the bigger themes that you've set out for. So if you said, hey, I'm going to develop process, I'm going to empower our people, and I'm going to help us figure out this new potential service offering, stick to that for your first quarter or 4 months or so, deliver back the results and talk about it in the broader business context, and then pick up responsibility from there.
So, and with that, the inverse of that might also be true, which is like one big mistake people make when they're executive joining a new company is just trying to move too fast, trying to do too many things at once before they've had an opportunity to observe and listen.
So true. And the observing and listening is critical, especially I would say in those first few weeks, maybe first 45 days. But by then you start to get a pretty good picture of what's going on. Then it's about understanding what the political climate is about and where you can make the biggest impact. And I think that's important for folks to remember when they're new to an org as well. It's like, great, there's a lot to clean up and there's a lot that needs to be built probably or changed. But what are the critical 2 or 3 things that's, the broadest strokes that are going to make the biggest impacts early on?
Yeah. So you one of the things, and sort of related to this, this is, I guess, a new way of thinking about being a leader, being mindful and self-assessing and really being aware of your gaps and displaying emotional intelligence. You've also said that there's a new approach to business and it requires a new mindset and skill set. And it relates to employee benefits, satisfaction at work, and bringing your whole self. So when you're thinking about employee benefits and satisfaction, like what do you think? You said business has changed. Walk us through what you mean by that as an operating company. What are the things that have changed, and how do the best companies position themselves in this modern era?
Well, I don't know who has it figured out totally right, but I do think there's a lot of good stuff happening. And, part of what I'm on a mission to solve is, what is that collection of things? But there are a few things that I'm observing. The first is that, especially when you're managing a millennial workforce primarily, their definition of work and their expectation of opportunities and their pace of growth is very different than when you and I were growing up, not to date ourselves, but, I think, when in my VP of account management role at eMarketer, at first I was managing for my first year, just the most senior sellers. And then they restructured it so that the customer success folks also reported in under me. So those were the people who were supporting the account directors and senior account directors. And of those individuals, they were incredibly talented outside of work and inside of work. They had multiple startups. One was recognized by the Bill Clinton Foundation for her not-for-profit work. One was a spokesperson for the Diabetes Foundation. So they just had arrived and have done such amazing things. Yet as a business, sometimes we were saying, hey, just do X. Here's your fixed box. Just do it, and we're going to give you great perks and bagel Fridays and unlimited vacation. But if they didn't feel their contribution for the business, they were disengaged. And so I do think it's important. We all have a job to do and a goal to achieve. But to the extent that we can give people a more malleable box so that creativity can come into play and they can create their own playbook in a way based off of what's already proven, I think that's where you get real commitment, longevity, and better contribution towards results. So that malleable box one is something that I'm really passionate about. In terms of the other things that a business can do, I think, when we think about feedback culture, I think companies either fall on one or two extremes. They're either waiting for that annual review and that's it, or they have a constant feedback loop. But again, it's all about the individual. What makes that person tick? The constant feedback loop might be too much for them. They might feel too under the microscope. So you have to find that right mix. But I feel strongly that you shouldn't be only coaching to that one annual review, and you should be giving people an opportunity to hear from you what's going right, what's not going right, where can they improve, so that they know that you have their best interest and growth in mind, and ultimately the business's growth in mind.
Absolutely. Managing that tension is very difficult. You've spoken a lot in the past about imposter syndrome, and it's something that so many people relate to. So why don't you help define it for us and explain how you think it holds people back? And then, what do we do with it if we have it, or if we think we've self-diagnosed as having it?
Sure. Well, the generally accepted definition of imposter syndrome is the inability to believe that your success is deserved and legitimately achieved and the result of your effort and skill. I see it showing up in a couple of ways. People who have perfectionist tendencies or sort of superhuman tendencies, the do-it-all person, or they call it a soloist, somebody who's just this like lone wolf who just says, I'm just going to take it all on myself because nobody else can do it as good as I can do it. But all the while, they're sort of doubting themselves in their mind. Should I be at this table amongst these great leaders or not? And so I think it's important to acknowledge, and I do think it shows up at different parts of life. There was a study that said, I think it was a 2011 study, so this is not a new concept, but it said that 70% of people will experience it at one time in their life. And this was by the Behavioral Science Research Institute, who published a paper on imposter syndrome. So, I mean, if 70% of us are going to face it, we really shouldn't be pretending it doesn't exist. It tends to show up more with women than men, according to these studies. And I think that's just due to, self-doubt is more prevalent, but really it can impact anybody at different times. And so it's important to acknowledge it, not hide from it, but then try to use it as fuel to say, okay, here I am. What are my gaps? Maybe I have gaps and that's okay, but let's work on taking action against that, filling them, or, working with a peer or a leader in my organization to identify if my thinking about my gaps are the actual gaps, and just sort of level setting what's real and what's in our own mind. And so much of like our own self chatter is what holds us back. And so it's about, sort of arming people to, move past that, acknowledge it, move past it, and then figure out their way forward.
So in terms of like actionable, I just think it's such an interesting topic. So part of it you're saying is acknowledge some of the reality. What do you do if, I guess, is there a thought process? Is there an exercise? Is it just mentally reassuring yourself? Is it some kind of mantra? How do you, I feel it frequently. So just as an individual, but if you're out there and you sort of wake up in the middle of the night feeling like, oh shit, I don't really know what I'm doing, even though I'm telling everybody I do. What do you do besides, say, well, maybe I really don't know what I'm doing, but like, how do you know the difference between what's valid and what's not?
That's probably the toughest question you'll ask me. So, I'll do my best here, but I do think, first of all, it's acknowledging that like, okay, everybody's felt like this, even if they don't admit it to you, right? Again, if 70% of us, if studies show that 70% of us are going to feel it at some point, chances are other people in your org have experienced it, even the best leaders. So that's number one, is just to like normalize it a bit. And then it's about like, I think a mindful leader is also a leader who recognizes that your job is never done. You're always on a pursuit of learning, of excellence. And so in that spirit, you can, apply that to your imposter syndrome and say, all right, well, maybe there is a gap here, and what can I do that's actionable to achieve it? Is it around my communication skills? Is it around, how I'm showing up each day? Or is it around, forecasting? Maybe there is something that I'm missing here. Maybe I need to take an Excel course to re-up my abilities there. So it's about sort of like parsing it out and saying, okay, what is just like fabricated in my mind and what is something that I can actually move forward with? And I suggest to people to have like an accountability partner in this. When I come into corporate settings and do workshops around this, we often will have the groups identify what type of imposter syndrome they face. So that way they see their peers, first of all, admitting that they feel this way. And then also they have somebody to turn to in the organization when it shows up. I also think it's important to have an open dialogue with your direct manager about this, or if you're a leader, to have it with your teams, so that perfection is not the only acceptable result. Well, so actually, it reminds me of so the founder of Spanx, Sarah Blakey, she talks about her father growing up, and he would say, how did you fail today? This is what he would ask at the dinner table, right? So it's like, it's embracing that concept of failing fast, but learning and growing from it.
Is that example of Sarah's father a good thing or a bad thing? That sounds like a difficult dinner table.
It is, but she credits that framework of thinking for her success. If things were just too easy, then she didn't push herself hard enough. And hey, it worked out for her. She's running one of the most successful self-run businesses, right? So
yeah, never raised any money. They're incredible. We love Spanx over here.
Is that what helped you look so good at the holiday party, Sam?
Absolutely. I'm covered head to toe in double Spanx layers. No, that's not true. Stephanie, one more topic before we close out our interview, which has been fantastic. But you talked about making the hiring process better for companies, and you also mentioned, because to your point, right? It's if you're trying to, and I think at this point it might even be beyond millennials. It might be Gen Z or whatever, Gen Next.
Right.
Youngsters, young people, people in their 20s, people that are new to the workforce. We need to rethink how we make companies attractive to them. What do you think we should do to improve our hiring process, to make it more effective, to improve it, to make it better?
Well, there's a couple things. I do think it's important that the firm who's hiring has a very clear set of values and expectations. That's going to make everything easier, because then they can also be seeking value alignment and sort of philosophical alignment. So that's number one. And also, more tactically, the people who are interviewing for that next, head of customer success or head of RevOps, can they all align on what, both quote unquote soft skills and practical skills are needed, so that when they are interviewing a variety of candidates, there's some sort of central place to keep that information and also to check against. I think gone are the days where you just have a chat, and leave it at that, right? It has to be more thorough, more thoughtful. I also think I hear way too much about ghosting happening, and I just think that's just really not acceptable in this day and age. I mean, time is money. People are really putting their all into the preparing for interviews and for the process, only to not hear back for weeks at a time. So just being really clear about what is your intention for this search, how much time, and what can the candidate expect in the process, and then sticking to that. Or if it needs to change, just communicating it. I think so much of it is around communication.
I agree with that. Awesome. Last part of the interview, we like to pay it forward a little bit and hear about some of your influences, some of the people that you respect, or some of the content that you've been consuming recently. So when you think about great founders, books you've read, where does your mind go? Tell us how we can follow the breadcrumb trail.
Well, like a lot of revenue leaders and business leaders, I love The Advantage by Lencioni, things around clarity, reinforcement, importance of building a cultural fit. I think that's so key for those undergoing change in organizations. And I see a lot of that in the work I do. Brave New Work is amazing. And it looks at, sort of the future.
That's a book?
It is a book. Yes, Brave New Work. And, sort of looking at the future of work and then creating operating systems that fuel that future of work, I think is really fascinating. So those are two examples. I love Sales Hacker for, actionable sales tips. And I'm not just saying that because I'm on here. In fact, I just put forward a list of podcast recommendations, and you were top of the list for a blog that I was contributing to. So
flattery will get you everywhere, as we always say.
Yeah. And then for women in the workplace, because I am a woman in the workplace and I work with women who are navigating challenging situations, I think The Broad Experience is a fantastic resource. It's a podcast that looks at things through, that anybody could find valuable, but especially women.
Awesome. The Broad Experience. Okay. That's great.
Yeah.
Brave New Work. And then Pat Lencioni, who wrote The Advantage. And he also, the one that made him famous was The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team.
That's right.
So folks are out there, those are the books, and that's the podcast, The Broad Experience. Stephanie, if folks are listening and they want to get in touch with you, maybe they want to hire Know and Flourish, maybe they want to hire you as a coach, or they just want to reach out and give you some feedback. Are you open to that? What's your preferred method of communication?
Sure. I'm always open to that. I would say LinkedIn is probably best. And I'm at, it's LinkedIn/in Blair Stephanie. So
Blair Stephanie.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, Stephanie, thanks for being on the show. We'll talk to you on Friday for Friday Fundamentals, and congrats on launching Know and Flourish. We're excited to watch the progress.
Thank you so much. It's been great being here.
Hey, everybody. Sam's Corner. Really enjoyed that interview with Stephanie Blair. And a few important things, I think, to remember as we reflect on what modern leadership means and what it means to be a great leader. I think that one of the things that she mentioned, just in terms of making and creating an environment where people of all generations want to succeed, is having a malleable definition of the job. I think that one of the things where we might have overcorrected is that we've got these jobs that are highly repetitive, that are pretty boring, and we just say, go do the job, and that's the skill that's required. And yet nobody at any higher level really would ever enjoy some of those jobs. I'm thinking of some of the sales development jobs or the customer support jobs that sometimes we create. So how do you create? She called it malleability or extensibility or flexibility, but how do you create an environment where people can do, yes, they have to do the things that they have to do, but they also have an opportunity to contribute in other ways and feel like they're making positive impact on the business and their voice is heard. So that was something that kind of I took out of that conversation. And then the second thing, we touched on it, but is this concept of imposter syndrome. And I mentioned I personally always feel imposter syndrome. And sometimes it's from one day to the next, one moment to the next. All of a sudden, I sort of get terrified that I don't really know what I'm doing and that, frankly, nobody likes me. And that I'm unqualified for and it's often a comparative thing. It's not just that I'm unqualified, it's that all of the other people are more qualified. They really have their shit together. I guess a couple things I would stress there as I've sort of struggled and thought through this. And Stephanie did mention that a lot of this is disproportionately in women. So some part of it is just, leap before you look. We've talked about on the show with other people that we've interviewed, the men have a greater tendency to just be willing to do a job that they are unqualified to do. And so if we're looking for parity in the workforce and we're looking for diversity and we're looking for the faces of the executives of the company to represent the faces of the world, then if you are an underrepresented group like a woman or a person of color, part of it is you just have to make sure that you raise your hand and you tell yourself that no matter what your inner monologue says, outwardly you force yourself to say, yes, I deserve this opportunity. I'm going to jump at this opportunity. Second part of that is understanding that everybody has this. So I just remember this famous story from the Civil War that my dad used to tell me that Grant, it was his first big battle and he was all excited about, but very, very nervous and very terrified and thinking that, he was really over preparing and the Confederates were right over the next hill and he rode over the next hill and the next morning when they were preparing for battle and they'd all decamped, they had fled. And he realized that they're just as afraid of us as we are of them. And that's an important thing to remember, that everybody goes through these feelings of insecurity. You are not alone. There are a few sociopathic people that don't have feelings of insecurity, but those people are few and far between. Most of us do have some level of vulnerability and insecurity, oftentimes coming from very early in our lives. So the important thing is to understand everybody is going through this. And then I think the final thing I would say to you if you're struggling with this is you need some kind of, do whatever you want. I don't care. But I do care. I want you to be happy. Part of you being happy is reorienting your inner monologue and that inner voice that tells you that you're not worthy or you're not good enough. And finding a way, it's not about being satisfied or complacent, but it's a way of reminding yourself and explicitly creating a narrative, which makes it feel a little cheesy sometimes, but a narrative around your positive self-worth. And many of you are too young, but some of you watched Phil Hartman do Stuart Smalley. No, it's Al Franken. Al Franken do Stuart Smalley in Saturday Night Live, and he would stand in front of the mirror, and it was a big joke. You're smart enough, you're good enough, and doggone it, people like you. But that's the essence of that is true. You do need an inner narrative, and you need to force yourself to say nice things to yourself, because if you don't do it, nobody else is going to. So you need to force yourself to commend yourself and give yourself positive feedback, and even sometimes staring in front of the mirror and doing it. But you need some actual activity. You can't just think about it. You need to say something, write something that is positive and helpful back to yourself. That is part of the key to success. Recognizing and understanding that you are flawed, but everybody is. Understanding that that's okay. Leap before you look and take on that new opportunity. And then finally create some mechanism that could even be you actually talking to yourself out loud. I am being that explicit, but create some mechanism through which you create positive affirmation about your self-worth. If you're not doing that and you're always down on yourself, and every time you talk about yourself, it's self-deprecating, it's not helping. You may think that it's helping and that it's humility. Sometimes it is, but often it's just not helping in quite the right way. That's my lecture for today. This has been Sam's Corner. If you want to reach out to me, you can. LinkedIn.com/Sam F. Jacobs. And if you want to thank our sponsor, Buy Outreach, they triple the productivity of sales teams and customer success teams and any team and empower them to drive predictable and measurable revenue growth. That's outreach.io. Thanks for listening to the Sales Hacker Podcast.